everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this morning on our last day of Advertising Week 2024. I think it's going to be a great day, and I'm delighted to be kicking off my morning here with James. My name is Kendra Barnett, and I am the U.S. Associate Editor at The Drum. And I am delighted to be joined by a brilliant mind in our industry, James Slezak, who has a very interesting background spanning everything from physics, research, advertising, digital strategy. So we're going to get into all of that. But it's really exciting to be on stage with somebody with such a rich perspective here.
Thanks.
So yeah, thank you. So we're going to be talking about creative effectiveness and creative testing. In our data-saturated world, I think it's become very apparent to a lot of people in this industry that the traditional creative process isn't always up to snuff anymore, and it demands a higher level of adaptability and agility. So that's where ideally agile marketing operations and rapid creative testing can come in and deliver stronger outcomes. So that's kind of the core of what we're going to talk about today. As I said, I think James has such a fascinating background spanning so many parts of the industry and outside of this industry. So I think it would be a fun place to start to hear a little bit about you, your background. You have a background, you have a PhD in experimental physics. You studied econ at some of the top institutions in the world. You founded an ad agency. You led digital strategy at the New York Times, all of that before founding Swayable. So walk us through that and your journey into advertising.
Well, I'd love to say it was like some deliberate, strategy from the beginning, but I guess I was just sort of drawn to problems that I think are interesting and important. Obviously, firms like the New York Times are telling incredibly important stories. So, especially as an immigrant from Australia, it felt like a kind of iconic place to spend some time. And I was lucky in a sense that, originally what brought me to the US was to do the PhD work in physics. And when you discover something new in experimental science, you're basically doing a measurement, and you have to do it better than anyone else has done it before, or you're not going to discover something new. And I was lucky in a sense that this problem about measuring the impact of stories really could draw on that experience, and that was really kind of the type of folks that we needed to kind of crack the problem of making a lift measurement, 10 to 30 times better than it had been done before.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Tell me a little bit more about Swayable's origin story and where the inspiration came from, how you assembled the team.
Yeah.
What's it look like so far?
Well, I mean, I'd always been really inspired, as I think anybody in this industry is, by the power of really big stories. They're being told to you not just to kind of get a little click on a rectangle or sort of drive up your traffic numbers, but they're designed to change the way you think about the world. Anything that's middle or upper funnel marketing, that's its job, lift. But typically those campaigns were being run without any real evidence that was happening. And that was true both for big stories, when I was at the Times about climate change, things that are not, commercial directly, but equally true about the commercial stories, again, with the New York Times, why should I subscribe? Why is this institution important? Why do I care about this brand? And so just with all these people running around telling these really important stories, I kind of felt like, if you can't measure it, you're not going to make it better. And there's always the adage about half of advertising being wasted. But if you can measure it properly, you don't have to have that waste. So we really wanted to crack that problem.
Cool. So a core idea of Swayable's business is rapid creative testing. What does that mean? How does that look like in practice?
Yeah, so I think the core idea people are familiar with, at least have been for decades, which is the idea of a brand lift study. So if your campaign is to get people to love your brand more or want your product more, whether it's a car or a holiday or a candidate for public office, you can do these experiments that can prove that. But traditionally, they've been very slow, expensive, and hard to do. They're months in the making. If you really drive the team really hard and you hire the right firm, you can maybe get them done in 6 weeks. But by that point, you've taken a whole bunch of decisions and it's too late. The campaign has deployed the media spend. Big decisions about what to produce have already been made. It's already been produced. So the big idea was, what if you could harness the power of modern tech, machine learning in the cloud, the access to thousands of respondents really easily on mobile devices, and do that experiment in 24 hours, not 24 or 48 days. In other words, speed it up by a factor of 30. It's actually possible. It wouldn't have been possible 5-10 years ago, but we've got the tech to do that now.
Interesting. As a follow-up to that, although you're saying the tech is relatively new, what hurdles exist in the marketing ecosystem? Like, why haven't more marketers adopted this approach?
Yeah, well, I think like any new thing, it is actually spreading incredibly quickly. I mean, our team sort of every time you turn around is much bigger. We've got, enormous deployments now. I think we just ran our 400th round of testing for one of the three. They used to be called FANG companies. I think now they're called the Magnificent Seven. So, there's sort of like early adopters, and the early adopters are kind of pulling in the middle adopters. But fundamentally, you've got to make the creative differently. That's why I think this is a great topic for the talk. It's not enough just to sort of plug in the tech, like it's sort of going to solve everything. It fundamentally needs leadership by marketers to say, hey, now we don't have to guess as much. Now we can get evidence at each stage of making this campaign. Let's plug it in. Let's, set up that decision meeting. Let's create that prototype creative that lets us learn if each decision is actually the right one.
You talked a little bit earlier briefly about lift and proof of lift. Why is that so important? Why is that valuable data to marketers?
Yeah, I think folks have been really enamored by what digital, measurement and digital platforms have let us do, I think, since the big ones were launched, 10, 15 years ago. They've started to realize, though, that the metrics that you get the most easily actually don't measure success for your campaign. So if you look on any of the big platforms, Meta's platforms, Google's platforms, Amazon's platforms, you're typically going to get a lot of reporting about who clicked and who, how much traffic you got. Typically, that's not the goal of the campaign. Now, if you're running sort of an ad for a t-shirt and you want a bunch of people to buy it in the Instagram feed, sure, that's the right metric. But most big marketers and brands, that's not what they're doing. You'll never see an Apple ad that says, click here, buy now, it's sort of 20% off, or, a Nike ad that's sort of, just trying to get that extra click, right? These are big storytelling campaigns, and success means I love that brand more. I want their products. So if you're not measuring the thing that defines success, you're not succeeding.
Yeah, it's a good point. So Swayable uses this term creative agility a lot, which intrigues me. I want to focus on the second half of that a little bit. Agility, speed, reacting quickly to things, happening in the culture, an event, a cultural moment. When we were talking about this previously, off stage, I mentioned to you that when I heard this term, one of the first things that came to my mind was maximum effort and the work that Ryan Reynolds does to capitalize on something really funny that's happening in the culture and produce a really sharp, witty campaign with this incredible turnaround. How is that possible? Do you think a team like that is able to do that effectively without rapid creative testing on the front end? What does the process look like? Yeah,
well, look, one of the biggest growth areas for us is working with folks exactly like that, who are replacing traditional, clunkier, frankly, older processes with, that sort of, influencer and creator-driven, fresh content. And so, I think that's sort of the best of both worlds. Make the stuff quickly. And when the brands are trying to pay your agency or your creator for that, they need to know that this is better than the old thing, so that it can get that share of their spend. And so, we're working with really large influencer agency. Influential, for example, has been doing an enormous amount of testing with us to hand over to the brands that are paying them the proof that that creative actually does why they're being paid, does what they're being paid for, which is make you want the product. So yeah, that's one of the big growth areas, because in a sense they've got to displace some of the spend that's being made in older ways. So they've got to sort of show up with that evidence, which I think is why it's a lot of the testing is linked to that.
Okay. I want to home in a little bit and get a little technical here. I think our audience is probably curious, how does this actually work? Can you walk us through the methodology?
Yeah, so basically, this is sort of where it was helpful to kind of pull together a group of scientists. The basic starting point is that you're doing something important. You've got to prove that you can generate this thing called lift, meaning thousands of consumers will see this thing. They're going to want the product more than if you didn't do your campaign, right? That's why we get the money. That's what all the creativity is for. And, in science context, the highest possible evidence, level of evidence is a randomized controlled trial. If you want to get a drug produced, drug, sold, the FDA will make you do that because, lives are at stake. We need to know if this drug works. Does it cause, you to have a lift in being well, So Swayable just implements an RCT, but, there's sort of doing it well and doing it quickly and doing it really effectively. So all of the engineering, tens of millions of dollars worth of product and tech and, now tens of millions of, respondents and tests going through it, has just pulled through a dramatic increase in like how effectively you can do it. Like it's literally 30 times better than what was possible before we launched it. So that means that measurement, actually, you can do it instead of waiting 2 months for it. And when you get the result, instead of it being this really uncertain number that, really imprecisely makes the measurement, you know that I've generated 5 percentage points of lift or 10 or 0. So you're like, that's the right thing to do, That's what I'm paying for.
So at that stage, if you have these insights, you're working with a client who might want something else, some other, how do we produce more lift? How do you iterate with them rapidly and change the creative?
Yeah, well, look, we're pretty narrow in our focus of kind of, we like to think of ourselves a bit like the lab technicians supporting the doctors and the nurses and everybody else who's doing the real frontline work. The creatives and the marketing teams, they know their business, they have ideas. We're not sort of seeking to replace that, but we're working with them to let them figure out if the ideas work. And in practice, that means that a lot of our top partners are folks that are driving transformations in the industries. We've got big management consultancies like Bain, agencies that kind of lean a little harder into not just let's do the creative for you, but how are you setting up your team and your operations and your processes. Let's look at the roles. Let's look at when things happen and why and on what cadence. So those groups are great partners for us because they can then, take this tech and say, oh, that lets us create a new process that replaces the old approach that was predicated on the lack of data with a new process that lets us make dramatic increases by, basically just iterating more quickly through more ideas. Can
you share with our audience a favorite client example or an example of a brand that has really done this successfully? Yeah,
there's so many. In terms of moving really quickly, we were just at the awards ceremony last week for the Advertising Research Foundation, and one of our big clients, Paramount Pictures, won an award for their Mean Girls campaign. And that's not just about was the ad great, but it's about how did you figure out to make that ad using data, including quite essentially from Swayable. The thing that's incredible about their job is, unlike a lot of marketing, they've got one shot to get it right. Basically, before you see a film, you don't know what the film's like. So you've got the marketing. And if the marketing works, you go see the film on opening weekends. And if the marketing doesn't work, you don't go see the film. And then the film's not on probably 3 weeks later because it's all about winning opening weekend. So those folks sort of from the beginning understood why, they're obsessively in the Swayable platform. Before the results are even finalized, they're kind of watching the numbers to see where they're going to land. So some industries like that kind of inherently just the need is so obvious that they've moved quickly. CPG is another one. And I think technology is another one because, the nature of their work is getting data quickly to see if what they're doing makes sense.
Nice. I wanted to ask about your professional journey here. Obviously, you've been at this a number of years now. What would you say is something that surprised you that you've learned along the process of building Swayable? Yeah,
I guess I'd sort of assumed that the minute that you could kind of make this measurement would sort of be immediately obvious to absolutely everybody straight away. And I think, maybe it was obvious in hindsight, I should have realized, but, storytelling about why this change is important is, important to sort of drive through the change in processes and behaviors. It doesn't sort of just happen automatically. Businesses don't immediately adopt a new technology. You need to kind of get out there and sort of talk people through it. So, I've realized that my job's a lot more, kind of doing this than it is sort of in the lab working on the product. Luckily, it's fun to talk to great people about, how it works, and that's fun too.
We're talking a lot about lift and about really persuasion, which is what Swayable does. At the end of the day is how do we measure persuasion of all kinds? I know that you work with brands, you do some work in the politics space as well. We're having this conversation 25 days before our presidential election, which is crazy to think about. But some estimates are estimating that we'll hit around $12 billion in ad spend for this cycle, which is about 30% higher than the 2020 cycle, which is staggering to me. It's incredible that campaigns are spending that level right now. Do you think that political campaigns and causes can learn from brands and brand success in the creative testing that you're doing at Swayable?
It's been really encouraging to see how much that's been true. Because, I say to the team, we of course, our first tests were on climate change, and we worked a lot on important causes really from the beginning. In fact, in the early days, that was mostly what we did. And then over, the ensuing years, we recognized that the rest of the marketing industry is so much larger that, ultimately that would displace the sort of by share that work. And now it's the vast majority marketing. But the cause-related work, including around elections, has continued to grow. And it's been fantastic that I think both worlds, they don't talk to each other very much, even though they're fundamentally trying to do something, as you said, persuasion. They want to change how you think. The little guy's head open up on Advertising Week, I think, kind of really symbolizes that. We're trying to change what goes on in there. We're not just sort of trying to drive the rat to the cheese by getting them to click on the mouse, right? So yeah, I think things that politics has really led on includes agility. I think those folks, like the Paramount example, their whole game is over. It's not just sort of like, do I get the promotion or not? It's like, do I have a job? Does this entire group of people move into the White House, or do they sort of spend 4 years being depressed? That's kind of the stakes obviously are really high there. So the agility is just absolutely sort of first nature to those folks. On the other hand, I think the marketing world has always been more sophisticated around segmentation. Who is the consumer? How do you break them up? Which chunks of groups of consumers and how they're defined will let the campaign succeed? And so, we're trying to get the social cause people to learn more about the sophisticated ways that marketers think about segmentation, and I think to some extent help the marketing world learn from the agility that you get automatically when you've just got that do or die moment in the first Tuesday of November.
Yeah, hearing you talk about segmentation, about audiences more generally, how closely does the creative testing go hand in hand with targeting and the other parts of effectiveness in the advertising pipeline? Are you talking to clients about those other elements of the ad tech pipeline specifically?
Yeah, I actually think that's sort of going to be probably the next wave of conversation that maybe we'll be having here more next year. I think segmentation has sort of stayed in the same place for decades. People do a segmentation study and they have these sort of, official segments in all of their brands, and they've got, often two-word names. At the New York Times, we had, ambitious optimizers, or, sort of rising achievers. There was two that were achievers. I can't remember what the other one was. One was rising, another was sort of already risen, kind of older, basically. And they're mostly demographics, but, with a little attitudes, sort of thrown in. So the big gap is that in these processes where you sort of just do research first and then go and do creative, you're missing that feedback cycle. And in particular, what you're missing is that the job of the creative is to generate as much lift as possible, right? So we've worked with a large technology firm, and they had their segmentation, and some great firm did it, a year ago, 9 months ago, and they were going to launch a new product. And it was like a bundle of tax and accounting software for small business owners. And they were like, oh, well, this is our segment that loves our products the most, right? Well, that was true. That research was right. The problem is the ads didn't do anything to lift that segment because they already knew about this product. There was another segment a little bit lower down, and it made a big difference to those people. So the point that I think the industry is sort of about to realize is that you can't do segmentation meaningfully without without connecting it to the lift that the creative causes. You can't just sort of sequence it like, we'll figure out the segments and then we'll go make creative. It's like the choice of segment has to be where the dollars go to generate the most increase in demand. And that's fundamentally a connection between the creative and the segments. It's not just a thing you do first and then, hand it over to the creative team.
Yeah. Interesting. So we're at Advertising Week. I can't let you leave the stage without talking about AI.
Of course, it's compulsory.
So it is. So, in your view, how is AI impacting organizations' ability to test, deploy, iterate at speed?
Yeah, well, we've been massive proponents from the beginning, and we try to sort of show, not tell, in the sense that we haven't been running around saying AI for 6 years, but we've been doing it. We're very proud, by the way, of one of our lead data scientists, Luke Hewitt, who has a paper coming out, which will be, I'm not allowed to say which journal, but, one of the top 2 scientific journals on AI. OpenAI is now quoting him in their kind of model reference card. So we're being quite proactive on this. The key thing in the day-to-day work that's changing is that you can now make prototype creative much more quickly. And so when you go from a world where it takes a team of people to do something, it takes a month or 2 to make something, to where individual people can just churn out, it's not like masterpieces, but that's the point, is like it's, a lot of extra volume to explore different ideas. The obvious question is, which ideas are the best ones? And so our whole job here is to try to encourage people to do that exploration using AI. And, they're starting to do a lot more prototype creative, meaning I've got an idea for a campaign, let's show it to a consumer in a form that looks roughly like what the finished product would be, even if it isn't the finished product. It's enough to test as a picture of a customer using our product ride, or as a family, racing home in a car ride, or as just a close-up of what the product's features are. There's many different ideas that everyone's contemplating. And we're now in a world where you don't just describe it to people or even use a mood board or a storyboard, I should say. You can actually kind of show it to the consumer. And so that lets you do the test much more quickly. And so we're sort of helping sort through that haystack to find those needles of just the killer ideas that previously you just couldn't even search through because of how long it took to make stuff.
Yeah. Are there any other technologies or trends that you're feeling are going to be worth more attention for marketers in the coming year or so?
Yeah, I think clearly AI is obviously a major driver, but the other one is the sort of singular channels that we used to have. We used to have television, and then we got digital, and the move obviously to influencers and the creator economy is another one that really does the same thing. It just means there's more content, and it puts even more onus on marketers to figure out which stuff works. So we're sort of deliberately placing a bet that all of that stuff is critical. It's going to change how marketers work, and fundamentally you're left with the question which things work and which things don't.
Yeah. If our audience here today leaves with just one kind of key takeaway, what should that be? Yeah,
well, I think the world's changed, and the things that used to not be measurable, or at least not very quickly, are now measurable, have been for the last couple of years. So, you can only get better if you're measuring them. So measure them.
Nice. Great. Well, we have a few minutes for questions. James is a fascinating person. Would love to hear from our audience. You can maybe submit something via Slido on the app, or I know we have some mic runners if anyone in the audience has any questions.
So the stimulus that you're using is just like a mood board or a storyboard or something that's not completely finished yet. And that's what you mean by getting before you go into production. And we've been doing that for decades. So really all you're doing is adding just a quick component to that is the first question. The second question is, and doing this for several decades, I think that going to finished film with creative and adding, the facial expressions and the music and everything that a good production does add to the lift in of itself. So the age-old problem with testing and creative has been testing just a storyboard or an animatic, as you will, PNG, God rest your soul. That isn't really the right magic that creative brings. So can you explain how now you feel like just testing a storyboard or a non-moving, non-full-up production is different with what you do?
Yeah, well, I think your first point is exactly right. A big thing that's changed here is just being able to get something tomorrow, not next month, which in a sense is sort of not that big a change, but is revolutionary in the sense that you just can't fit a month into most, production processes or, timelines. People are churning out creative that needs to be out that week, not sort of, in 2025. So I wouldn't underplay how much speed is kind of, speeding something up 30x makes a big difference. But you're also completely right. Storyboards and animatics, there's been ways to test those. And certainly the finished creative, should be better than the animatics, or we just go stick the animatics on everyone's, billboards and TV screens. But the key point, there's two key points. One is that the core idea fundamentally is the most important thing about the campaign, not the specific execution details. Those do matter. Getting it right matters, otherwise don't bother, doing good productions. But, when the core idea of your campaign is this is a killer product with this value prop versus, this other value prop or this particular kind of persona or is going to present it, that's the big decision. You might spend $1 million on a celebrity, or you might not bother. You might get a customer. Those big decisions ultimately are at the core of the branching decisions you take that show up in the set of different campaign content that gets created. And then, of course, at the channel level, the individual executions of the channel. So optimize for the channels, absolutely. But at the branch of that tree of decisions is this is going to be an ad with Danny DeVito in it, or it's going to be an ad from a customer that's happy with our, tax preparation software. So, are we just guessing about that, or are we going to use some evidence? So that's the key thing. I would say, by the way, on the animatics and storyboards, we really encourage people not to test animatics and storyboards. We try to use the word prototype creative. And what we mean by that is, if you make a storyboard, that is made for production people to look at. Storyboards have, the character will do this, the voiceover will say that. Consumers aren't trained to look at storyboards. So the best kinds of tests that people are doing on Swayable are actually not storyboards or sometimes animatics at all, but they're what we call prototype creative. In other words, the same idea, but for a consumer, not for, the creative room.
We do have a couple questions that popped up here on the app.
Oh, yeah.
I'm not familiar with Realize. Somebody asked, how is Swayable different from other tools out there like Realize?
Yeah, there's a really great resurgence, I think, in pre-testing. And, there are many firms that are doing really great work. I think Realize, to my understanding, is doing eye tracking. And that's great. I mean, I think it's an important piece of input of people paying attention to the parts of your creative that are important. So if the question here is how is Swayable different from other tools like that, basically 2 words. Swayable proves lift. So your eye can look somewhere, but it could be somebody else's ad. It could be a cartoon, a Mickey Mouse cartoon. That is irrelevant information, but is not proving lift.
Somebody else asked, do you recommend testing earlier or later in the creative process?
All of the above, yeah. I think the best processes will start with the big idea, find a way to express that to the consumer, figure out if that's even on the right playing field. Do people want to see what this celeb says, or do they want to feel this emotion, or do they want to know about this aspect of the value proposition or not? Now I'm going to generate a whole bunch of ideas and I'm going to test those. And of course, when I've got the finished product, did the execution work? I'm about to spend hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars on the media. Certainly a very good idea to know whether that's actually going to, in a controlled environment, generate the lift that I'm spending all that money to generate. So, it's kind of all of the above. Obviously, we sell the testing, so we would say that, but it's true.
And then you did share one example, but somebody else asked if you can share any other real-world outcomes from brands that have used Swayable.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the election topic, maybe just because that's timely. One of the things that stood out to us the most was the last election cycle. We worked a lot with a large PAC trying to get people out to vote. And what they used to do is kind of make a small amount of content, and then maybe, if they could figure out how to test it before they put it on the TV. It was typically TV campaigns. Instead of that, they hired a bunch of folks that had media backgrounds actually and made really quick kind of, straight to social content. And they set up 1 to 2 week processes iterating on the ideas. Had 5 or 10 ideas on different policy areas or different aspects of the character of the candidate. And then instead of just sort of putting the ones on TV that worked and dropping the other ones, they fed into the next week's creative the insights from that testing. And some of it was completely unexpected. Certain ideas actually backlashed. Other ideas did nothing. But some worked really well. 2 points of lift, 2.5 points of lift. So then the next week, they're like, well, let's try to do more stuff like the good stuff. Let's just not do the bad stuff. And they doubled the sides of the highest score they got for lift. They did it the 3rd week. They basically eliminated all the negative stuff and the average went up again. They did it a 4th and a 5th week. They got 10x, literally no exaggeration, hit me up for the case study, go talk to the client. 10x the amount of lift on average for the final slate of creative that they made after 5 iterative rounds.
Wow.
Than 1x. So I would challenge anyone to find any other lever you've got in marketing that can ever demonstrate a 10x lift,
Yeah.
Relatively systematically. But the core idea is, again, you measure it, you can figure out what works. Otherwise, you're just in the dark. And someone will tell you that we got some clicks or people's eye looked in the right place, but that's not the job of the creative. It's to, change what's in the guy's head in this logo. So once you get that information, the magic happens. Yeah.
Nice. Okay, well, thank you all so much for being here. Thank you to James, thank you to Swayable, and to Advertising Week New York for having us.
Thank you.